And now that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to our two speakers for Meet the Night. And I believe, Marty, it's you who's going to start, and I'll leave the presentation about yourself and what you're doing and how this is all coming together. I'll leave that to you. And thank you very much. Let's get started.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bettina, and thank you for the warm welcome. And hello, everybody. It's great to be on the call with you, and it's great to be partnering with the German Chamber and also with Fiona from Argyll Law, who'll be chatting in a little bit on this session tonight. So I'm just going to share, and I need to, maybe Bettina, if you allow me to share my screen. I think you might need to unshare your presentation, and then thank you. And then I'll just share my presentation. Excellent. Excellent. So tonight and today, we're going to be going through in fairly rapid fire, but we do encourage questions from anybody on the call. So please raise your hands, and my colleagues will be monitoring the chat if you have any questions in there, or just come off mute and yell out throughout the presentation. We love for the interaction, and we've got time for questions at the end as well. But broadly, we're talking about commercialization in Australia. We have lots of questions from overseas companies about commercialization in Australia and what that looks like and what are the opportunities from an Australian perspective. And we'd like to answer those questions as much as we can tonight on this call. So just a little bit about Access Healthco is a Australian and London-based healthcare consulting practice that can facilitate access to the greatest diversity of opinion from the commercialization journey. Our entire team comes from a range of different backgrounds within the healthcare sector, and as an advisory group, we can manage a number of problem statements and challenges and questions from the healthcare community that potentially some other organisations cannot. And with our partner Argyll Law, who covers all of the questions related to legal and sponsorship, from our perspective, we have a really balanced and tailored offering to the healthcare market as a whole. I'm going to really quickly introduce the team. The majority, all but one, are on the call with us tonight. As you can see there, I'm not going to read through the details, but from a role perspective, Kieran, who cannot join us today, has extensive experience in government affairs. Nikki, who's on the call and might put up a hand and wave, is in commercial development, but also patient access and new product, patient advocacy and new product planning. Vanessa is our people and culture expert. James has significant experience in general management in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as marketing across Europe and the US. I'd like to introduce myself, Marty Hayes. I come from a very strong commercial background with some new product planning, market access as well, but primarily sales and execution in market. Dr. Dan Thurley is our medical affairs expert. Dan has a diverse background from a healthcare perspective. He's a consultant physician in pharmaceutical medicine and specializing in clinical trials. He's also been the general manager for some of the affiliates for Roche products, and has also been the medical director amongst a range of other roles, and currently works at one of the leading universities here in Sydney as well. And Kate Webb, who's based in London. Hey, Kate, is our market access expert. And Kate has worked with some of the most significant global brands in a range of market access roles across ANZ, APAC and Europe. And together we form Access Healthco, and it's our pleasure to be sharing us the information around the Australian healthcare sector today. So with the German Chamber of Commerce, I think it's just a few key points here. Some of the things that we might be able to support organisations and partnering with the German Chamber include strategic market entry support. Expert-led training, so where there's a specific need or requirement from organisations, we can certainly adopt that on a very specific basis. We develop customised learning pathways and training modules, but probably most importantly is our network and facilitation within the Australian ecosystem, Australian and New Zealand ecosystem. And we can also add additional offerings on behalf of the Chamber as well. So that is Access Health Co. Really briefly. And I'd also like to introduce Argyll Law on behalf of Fiona. And Fiona, please jump in if I do miss anything here. It's our pleasure to work directly with Fiona and the Argyll Law team. Is a specialist Australian firm. They certainly have deep expertise in foreign-owned companies in the health and life sciences and biotech sectors. Fiona and team work closely with German and European-based organisations, and Fiona speaks fluent German. Maybe we can hear you speak some fluent German tonight, Fiona, depending on the questions, etc. And Fiona offers sponsored structuring and TGA compliance, cross-border distribution, commercial contracts, risk management, disputes and investigations. And if I can add one more, just a very pragmatic and practical person to engage with when you have just broad questions around the Australian healthcare market and the legal implications of such. So I think Fiona will introduce herself further as the call goes on. And just a disclaimer here that this document and everything we share is general in its overview. And at the time of writing, it's broad and continually evolving, no doubt, as it is across the globe. And this means the information here may not be up to date at the time you review it, may not be comprehensive or directly attributable or applicable to your circumstances. But please reach out to Fiona or reach out to myself if you have any questions, and we'd love to support your specific circumstances moving forward. Okay, really quickly, the agenda. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the Australian political landscape. We just had a federal election, which is a very significant one for us here in Australia, which James will talk to. We're going to have Fiona speak to people and culture. We're going to have Kate and Nikki talk to regulatory and market access in Australia. James will come back and speak about market opportunities. We have clinical trials and innovation and research and development led by Dr. Dan Thurley. And then Fiona will be taking us through the options to establish a presence in Australia, and then we'll have some Q&A time at the end as well. So without further introductions, I would like to hand over to James now to take us through the Australian political environment and overview. James.
Thank you very much, Marty, and hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to make this short presentation on behalf of my colleague, Kieran Schneemann, who unfortunately cannot be here this evening. He is our government affairs and political expert, so no doubt I will not be able to do adequate justice to his slides, but I'll do my very best. As Marty alluded to, in Australia, we've recently had a federal election, and the results of that were quite interesting. And I want to discuss that a little bit with you this evening, and also think about and talk about some of the impact that that's going to have on the healthcare environment and what to think about should you be looking to come into the Australian market. As I mentioned, federal election, the Labor government was returned to power. They were initially elected in 2022 after about 9 years in opposition. Prior to the election, a lot of the political commentary was suggesting that the Labor government would probably be returned to power, but absolutely nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, was able to predict the landslide with which the Labor government was in fact returned to power in Australia for probably not just the next 3 years, but probably an additional 6 and maybe even further 9 years, given the extent of their win. Everybody was anticipating the election was going to be a referendum around the cost of living, which is a common theme, I imagine, through many other developed markets around the world. But it turned out to be more about stability and who do you trust to run the country in what has become more of an uncertain and disruptive environment, I think, based on many of the decisions we see coming out of the US administration. And as such, the Australian electorate decided that they would stick with the government and the Prime Minister that they knew. And so hence Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was returned with a real landslide. Healthcare was an important issue in the election. It was second only to the cost of living crisis. And I think there are going to be some important implications. There were some important promises made prior to the election, specifically around healthcare. Post the election, the Prime Minister has consolidated his cabinet, and the previous incumbent in health, Minister Mark Butler, has retained the healthcare portfolio, but he has also inherited what was known as the NDIS, or the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is a very large portfolio. So that has been combined into what we're calling a mega health and disability portfolio here in Australia. And that has some important implications moving forward, which I'll come to in just a second. But the government's priorities in health remain relatively unchanged. However, there will be some implications for them moving forward, just because of the situations that we find ourselves in. But in general, I think the Labor government is very receptive and very much open to attracting investment, particularly from overseas countries. And healthcare is one area that they're very keen to expand. So I think there are probably going to be some great opportunities for companies and individuals that want to enter the Australian market. There are many incentives around manufacturing, particularly sovereign manufacturing. And a good example of that we've seen in recent times is the government partnering with Moderna to set up an mRNA manufacturing facility here in Australia to produce 100 million vaccines a year. So those sorts of opportunities are real, they exist, and governments are looking to partner with organisations that are prepared to invest in infrastructure that they deem to be important. The other aspect that the government has proven very good at supporting is medical research, particularly in the clinical trials area. A couple of reasons for that. One, it is a very large employer. Some 8,000 people are employed in the implementation of clinical trials here in Australia. And importantly, it offers patients a way to gain access to clinical trial care and potentially to new medicines that otherwise would not be available to them. And of course, Australia is world renowned for the quality of the research that they conduct and the acceptability of the research that Australia produces by overseas governments and regulators alike. Marty, maybe we can move to the next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just setting the scene a little bit. But now that the government has won the election, there are some issues that they're going to have to contend with. So not everything is straightforward. And I think it will probably surprise none of you that the cost of implementing healthcare and providing healthcare globally is increasing. And that is no different here in Australia. We have an aging population. So there are more and more people that are accessing healthcare facilities. And of course, just by way of the volume increasing, that also automatically drives prices. Now with this new combined mega portfolio, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is is a significant investment on the part of the Australian taxpayer, and that investment has been deemed to be blowing out in the previous 3 years. So there's some significant cost containment that will have to be looked at across the NDIS scheme in particular. Overarching all of this is the government debt that they have. We have government debt at a record level of 1 trillion Australian dollars. And so the government is very conscious of this and is looking for savings in all areas of government spend. And in particular, if your business, if your products are able to assist the government in to drive savings, they would be particularly interested in talking to you as well. This has to be coupled on the back of election promises around greater investment in primary care, also greater investment in hospital care as well, and the need for more trained medical practitioners and healthcare workers. So Marty, next slide, if we could, please. So we mentioned the cost of health and the mega department that has now been created. And whilst this pie chart is indicative of the percentage of government spend prior to the election, it's worth noting that in the bottom left-hand corner there, health was standing at 16%. So prior to the election, a significant area of government spending in isolation. The area to the top, the social security and welfare, is where we previously found the allocation for expenses for the NDIS scheme. So if you can imagine that about half of that has now been removed and placed in with health, creating a spend centre that's approximately 34%. So without question, health and the NDIS scheme is now accounting for more than a third of government spend, and so will be a tremendous focus, and there's a tremendous responsibility for Minister Mark Butler as well moving forward. Next slide, Marty. Thank you. I apologise, this is a little bit light, but it's just designed to look at the two columns on the right-hand side, looking at the Australian Labor Party, which is the government, the persuasion of the government that's in power now. In the last election, they have claimed 94 seats. In the election prior, they had 77. And it's worth noting that for a government to have a majority, they require 76 seats. So not only did the government have a majority in the previous term, but it has significantly increased its majority in this new term moving forward. And this is the largest majority that a Labor government has ever had in its entire history in the Australian political scheme. So this is quite significant. Of equal significance is the Liberal coalition that had 58 seats in the last government and has been reduced to only 45 seats moving forward. And those seats, unfortunately, are by and large only in rural areas and not representative of the community in metro cities. Labor has dominated the metro cities within Australia from this past election. Next slide, Marty. Thank you. Again, without sort of rehashing these numbers, just to illustrate the significance of the landslide victory that Labor attained in the election. And of equal interest on the right-hand side of this slide are those numbers that are reflective of the number of women that are in Parliament by each party. And we can see that the ALP in red, or the Labor Party, has more than 50% of their sitting members are women at 54. And conversely, the Liberal National Party have 7 out of 43. And that's a significant issue for the Liberal National Party, and one that the Australian electorate is seeing and is not very appreciative of. I think that what is going to be very interesting to watch moving forward is how the coalition pick themselves up, develop their policies, refresh themselves. But it's the opinion of our government relations expert that that is probably unlikely to happen in time for the next election or the election after that. And so we may be seeing a period of opposition for the Liberal Party by the time we get to 2031 of potentially 12 years. And the implications for that are significant. Marty, next slide. Thank you very much. So this is the health minister in the middle, Mark Butler, and to the far left is who do we have? We have Jenny McAllister, and to the minister's immediate right, there is also Emma McBride. And the reason that I'm highlighting these two individuals is that of this ministry, These are the only two members that have any experience at all in the business of government. The other three members are all brand new and have been promoted into this field. So I'm going to wind up here, but just to say that I think with a Labor government that has been elected clearly with a mandate and it is likely to be in power for a long time, if you understand what their priorities are and align yourself to those priorities and help them to implement those priorities, there will be tremendous opportunities in the Australian environment for you. Thank you very much, Marty.
Thank you, James. Really appreciate that, and for doing that on behalf of Kieran as well. I'll just pause really briefly to see if there's any questions from the audience. Otherwise, there is a question time at the end of the presentation as well. And if my colleagues can monitor the chat for me, that would be fantastic. No questions. Fantastic. We'll go on to people and culture, and I'm going to hand over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Marty. If you could go to the first slide, that would be wonderful. Okay, so I wanted to begin by setting the scene a little bit. Australia's healthcare and life sciences sector is globally renowned and respected for its maturity, its governance, and also its people-first culture. But it's not a market you can simply just enter with a great product or expect success to happen immediately. It really actually does come down to the people that you choose to employ to join you. In Australia, success hinges just as much on who you bring with you as what you bring to the market. So this is a sector shaped really by regulation, and really importantly, it's about relationships. So from employment law, TGA and PBS compliance to a really deeply connected stakeholder networks. So I look at it really from a point of 4 pillars that define the Australian workforce environment. Firstly, compliance and fairness. So it's not just legal, it's embedded, it's cultural. It's embedded in the way we think and the way we work. So doing the right thing is built into the expectations of every employer and leader. Again, as I mentioned, you've got the compliance with the TGA, the PBS and employment laws, and that is respected and it's expected. Secondly, you've got a decentralized and empowered workplace. So hierarchies are flatter here, and employees are motivated and expected to contribute meaningfully at every single level throughout the organization. Third is more of a sophisticated talent market. So people in Australia really understand healthcare inside and out, but they also hold very high expectations for their leadership, for the communication, both internal and external, and the outcomes. And when I say outcomes, I'm really meaning the impact that they have on the patient and the overall ecosystem. The workforce here expects fairness, clarity, and above all, they expect respect. So authentic leadership, psychological safety, collaborative execution, these really aren't optional, they're expected and they're the standard. The fourth is more of a trust-based network. So your reputation, the way you operate, the way you engage, the way you behave, all of this really matters. In fact, it matters quite significantly. Australia is a very small, well-networked community, and word travels very fast. Trust is built through consistency, professionalism, and a genuine engagement, and all of this really determines the success or the failure. Now, this is all really important to keep in mind if you are thinking of expanding over here into the Australian market, is your people strategy is not a secondary stream. It really is your market strategy. Marty, would you mind just popping over to the next slide?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. So Australia is a very competitive market. So it's really important to understand what it takes to build. And when I say build, it's acquiring, it's hiring, and it's retaining that winning team. It starts with having a really well-defined and well-communicated purpose. As we all know in healthcare, especially in areas like oncology or rare diseases, people want their work to make a real difference and have an impact. And the mission that you create really has to be clear so they understand what that impact is. Then comes growth. So top candidates in the market, they're not just looking for a title, they're really looking for career pathways. They're looking for cross-functional learning experiences and development that's visible and real. Then it comes to flexibility and well-being. These are no longer perks. So here, hybrid work, autonomy, and mental health support, as an example, they're all expected. If you miss the mark here, you'll really struggle to attract top talent. Of course, compensation matters a lot, and it needs to be competitive. With compensation, it's including base, car, superannuation, incentives, and a few other financial as well as non-financial benefits. But to be honest, culture is what really makes people stay. The culture that you develop is your differentiator. The best hires that you can focus on when coming to the market, they bring sector fluency, they bring established networks, and they bring culture agility. They're able to navigate complexity, influence without authority, which is quite a key one, and they can understand how to get things done in the local context. So ultimately, building a winning team means becoming the kind of organization that really great people want to grow with, not just join. You're not just really hiring the talent, you're building a reputation as an employer of choice. Marty, would you mind popping to the next slide, please?
Mm-hmm.
So how you choose to enter the Australian market has quite a big impact on how you build your team and shape your culture and establish your brand in the market. And I know Fiona will touch on this, and Marty's touched on it already, but there are 3 common pathways: the subsidiary, the sponsor, and the distributor. But I'm going to talk about it really from that people and culture perspective. So the subsidiary gives you control. You can recruit locally. You can embed your values. You can build a culture that really reflects your global brand. But it does require significant upfront investment and local HR capability. The sponsor model, often used for the regulatory entry, it allows for a leaner setup and early traction, but your ability to shape team dynamics or culture is a little bit limited. And then there's the distributor model. This is quick, it's low risk, but it's also completely hands-off. You will sacrifice the visibility, the talent engagement, and the alignment to your brand values. There is going to be no perfect choice here, but whatever model you choose, you need to really make sure you're embedding the people and culture into the decision-making process, and you need to do it early, because how you enter the market sets the tone for how you lead and how you grow fast. Marty, could you pop to the last slide, please?
Mm-hmm.
So what does success actually really look like when entering the Australian market? Companies that get it right clearly lead with people from the very beginning. They hire smart. They hire local leadership with decision-making authority. And these people are generally individuals who have really strong credibility, great context, and credibility as well as the capability. They localize their strategy to reflect Australia's regulatory and funding environment. It's not a plug and play market, so localizing it is absolutely critical. These organizations also build highly collaborative, cross-functional teams very early. So they're aligning their commercial teams, the medical, market access, and the reg teams. So everyone, throughout their growth journey, they all move as one. They also onboard overseas leaders early on and with intentional purpose. So what I mean by that is they're teaching them the systems, the governance, the stakeholder rules of engagement, and also the cultural language that underpins the success here. And they use flexible hiring models to stay agile. So that would mean balancing their internal capabilities with expert consultants that are available in the market and also their trusted local partners. Retention starts on day one. Success comes not just from entering the market and getting that access, but from that really strong cultural alignment and that long-term trust. Then you don't just hire the right people, you retain them for the long term. And then, like I say, building and scaling from there. So to truly succeed in the Australian market, you can just enter it, or you can really embed in it. The companies, as I mentioned, that really succeed here are the ones that go beyond the headcount. They go beyond the individual. They create a unique culture and they nurture that culture. They build a strong credibility and they grow with intention. So finally, before we move on to the next speaker, I just wanted to really highlight again that as you plan your strategy for Australia, it is so important to remember it's not just about systems and structures. It really is about people. So the right leadership, the right partnerships, the right culture, and then you can act early, you can lead locally, and then you can show up with strong purpose. Thank you, Marty.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vanessa. And again, I'll just pause there before we jump to the next session to see if there's any questions from the audience. No, I don't think so at this time. So let's move on, and thank you again, Vanessa, to the regulatory environment and market access. And I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Nikki and Kate, to take us away. Nikki, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Marty. I'm just going to start off by setting the scene. So if you can go to the first slide, Kate and I will do a little bit of a tag team because regulatory and market access is always very, very closely bonded. So following on from James and Vanessa's discussion around what is happening in Australia politically and what is our culture like, here is an overview of the Australian health landscape. And it's quite complex and quite connected. And I will take you through in the next couple of slides the different drivers around the funding, who gets money from where, and also how this is distributed across the country. So if you can go to the next slide, Marty, there you go. Great. So the market access pathways that Kate and I are going to talk about are specifically around the registration and then reimbursement. They run almost in parallel, as you can see in the slide here. When you start your regulatory process in Australia, you should be starting your market access process at the same time and having a very, very clear strategy. We have multiple options for early access to market, like the SAS program. And as soon as you get your TGA approval, you can also do patient familiarization programs. So there's a range of opportunities to get early access to market throughout your development process. So if you can go to the next slide. Linking back to the first slide that I provided you with, which just gave a really broad overview, our health system is essentially run from our federal government. They develop the national health policy. They regulate medicines and medical devices. They fund medical service through Medicare, MBS, and PBS, and NDIS, which is the disability care. They provide funds to the states and territories for public hospital services. So in the next column, you'll see the state and territory governments. They're funded for many activities via the federal health system. And that often causes a little bit of difficulty with where the funds are from. So you've got to be very clear about which market you're going into and who will be the funder going forward. They also fund population-specific services, health and medical research, and support access and regulate the private health insurance market. With respect to your state and territory governments, they really fund and manage your public hospitals and delivery of services and in-hospital interventions. Sometimes your products straddle both of these, and you need to manage both of these environments. The state and territory government also regulate and license private hospitals and other health premises. They regulate products with health impacts such as alcohol and tobacco. So those are generally their variations across different states. And you'll find that with quite a few products. And they also deliver community-based and preventative services. Then you have local health networks, which often are childhood care services. So doing the early childhood checks, they'll have childhood clinics or vaccination programs. So there are a whole lot of local health network and community services that are delivered based on the local health area. So it is a little bit of a mix. Now I've put in different colors the private health cover and private pay. Private health cover, people pay for their own private insurance, which gives you the opportunity so that even if you need to go to a public hospital and you'll see the same doctor, you might be able to get in earlier if you have private hospital, and there's some different fee structure. So our private health system does support and work really closely with our federal and state and territory health systems. We then also have private pay. So once a product is on the ARTG, which is listed by the TGA, people can pay for it independently. Now, most Australians expect their healthcare to be funded by their government or state system, but there are many things that are paid for privately, and that is a growing area as well. Next slide, Marty. I just wanted to, like Vanessa spoke about, the principles or the pillars within the people and culture. Within our regulatory and market access, we have some principles that you really need to embed with the work that you do. Everything is very strongly evidence-based and data-driven. So safety, efficacy, and quality in your evidence that you're putting together is paramount. They're going to be looking for that. Data, we have strong, they'll use clinical trial data, and our real-world data is evolving. I would love to say it was stronger, but it is still evolving. But it is with the intervention of AI, realizing how fast and how valuable it can be going forward is really growing quite rapidly, and government and policy organizations are getting more comfortable with it. Equity of access, we have a universal access approach as outlined earlier, but that a critical thing to take away is we've got a high metropolitan area, a lot of people living in the cities, but we have strong growth in our regional areas, and we have a lot of people in our remote areas. Every product developed is expected to be able to be delivered throughout the country. If you came with a product that really needed a different kind of infrastructure in a regional remote area, you would have to try and solve that problem. But often these are supported by your states and territories if they are trying to get access out to different groups. Patient-centered care, our models of care, our patient advocacy really focus around patients, and that is growing stronger every day. We also recognize are extremely fortunate to have ethnic diversity in our country. Our Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander communities have strong cultural awareness and strong engagement within our health system. And we have a lot of support for people from cultural and linguistically diverse populations. We do have interpretation services. So if you have a product and you've got somebody coming onto your clinical trial that's from another nationality, there are interpreter services available as well. Policy and governance, very, very strong. You've got to adhere to that going forward. There is a lot of engagement around policy in Australia going forward. Just to confirm, there's a strong established infrastructure delivering national services, and we have a lot of support going forward. Marty, I think I need to hurry up. So next slide, please. All right, therapeutic goods. So the TGA, if you wanted to get a product on the market here, you'd have to go to TGA. Just in summary, our pharmaceutical regulation pathway really is very aligned with the FDA and EMA. They accept evidence from those groups, and there are many work share and mutual recognition agreements. So if you're part of the Project Orbis, you can use that same acceleration pathway here. It is quite, the pharmaceutical process is quite structured, and it is tried and tested. You can engage really nicely with the TGA on your product, so you feel supported throughout the process. With respect to medical devices, I think most of you have got medical devices in the audience will know that it's just it so varies on what your device is and what's its risk profile and what's its intention for use. So we work really well with other bodies internationally, as well as the notified bodies internationally. I think we're probably more aligned with Europe than with the US, but all of the work that has been done by those regulatory authorities internationally and those notified bodies is accepted here and worked into our programs. I just wanted to flag software as a medical device. That is quite a challenging space. In 2021, there were reforms to try and manage the clinical decision support capabilities that are involving. So depending on what your software as a medical device is, we fully recognize that there are some parts that might need to be managed slightly differently within the regulatory process. And the changes that AI are bringing are really top of mind and trying to be included in a pragmatic way. So while we engage closely with the European groups and are part of a lot of the AI groups in Europe that are discussing what policy changes and processes and procedures should be around from a protection of patients' perspective. Next slide, Marty.
Mm-hmm.
Great. This is just a summary to say we're very collaborative. The ARTG, the registering on the ARTG is mandatory for any product coming through. Very collaborative, and we have a very structured process. We did want to highlight that if you have an indication that is different to another jurisdiction, that is acceptable. You might have, based on different populations or different data sets, a different indication that's used in Europe or in Germany than in Australia. We can adapt to that. We see that all the time. We do like to optimize the commercialization of the asset by really looking at your regulatory strategy and how to take it forward. So somebody like Kate and myself and the clinical trial group and the market group usually work really tightly to have a clear strategy going through. In Australia, we call it new product planning. And having a new product planning mindset really helps you to accelerate your product through to market. And then a different label, you can have a different label, and that may influence your price and market size. And that's a perfect segue to you, Kate, because that is in your court.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Marty, may I have the next slide, please? Hello, everyone. So reimbursement. You're all very well aware of the different systems for funding around the world. Obviously, IQWiG in Germany. The Australian healthcare funding environment has similarities and dissimilarities. Health technology assessment is the basis of the Australian funding process for medicines, and in fact, Australia was the first country in the world to mandate an economic evaluation for an asset that was going to be considered for national funding. And I have been told by many global colleagues over my 20 plus years doing this area that we're the cancer that spread around the world. But I think what's really interesting about it is very well set out. The Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee is the key Australian authority for funding medicines. It's independent. a non-statutory authority set up by the government, but it is completely independent. It's a membership, very mixed membership of clinicians, health economists, a patient advocate, and it makes recommendations to the Australian Federal Minister of Health about whether a medicine can be put onto the National Drugs List, which is the Pharmaceutical Benefits Schedule. MSAC, which is the Medical Services Advisory Committee, does a similar job for devices and interventions that are not pharmaceuticals and other programs such as blood products or screening programs. A medicine cannot be listed on either the PBS or the MBS without a positive recommendation from either the PBAC or the MSAC to the Minister of Health. The PBAC process, which is the overwhelming process by which most new interventions enter the market, does have similar data requirements as other HTA agencies, though it is usually less receptive to lower levels of clinical evidence. And this is where the real-world data piece that Nikki mentioned earlier and the use of AI to capture data through clinical trials particularly and data registries is becoming more and more important. The prescribed timelines, this is quite an interesting area and one that causes global companies quite a little bit of surprise because the PBAC process is really quite short compared to other markets. It's only 16 weeks between the lodgement of your reimbursement dossier and the PBAC's decision. So my big message to people that I've worked with over the years is really do your homework. As Nikki was saying earlier, and Vanessa, it's really important in Australia to have an embedded matrix environment in which all the functions are very closely aligned and working collaboratively together, because a dossier that's been put into NICE is not going to suit the PBAC's requirements, and the label that you get in Australia may influence where you go for reimbursement. For example, if you have a large population, but there's a subgroup that was pre-specified in your clinical trial where there's an enormous benefit compared to the overall population, you may end up with a much better price and a much better revenue stream from going for that particular subgroup for funding. Different prices apply for different indications for the same molecule, so it's quite a complex market in terms of the pricing considerations in this country. And I mentioned about the NICE and the PBAC do have different requirements for health economic models, and the PBAC has, or the guidelines have much more restrictive requirements for the inputs to the health economic models. And when you change things like time horizons and discount rates, it makes a massive effect. And that's why you've got to really be understanding of the environment, and you can't just put in a NICE or a model to the Scottish Medicine Consortium and expect it will be accepted. Two specialist subcommittees support the PBAC. There's the Economic Subcommittee, which is the most influential, and the utilisation estimates are assessed by the Drug Utilisation Subcommittee. What is particularly notable in Australia is, unlike other jurisdictions where the sponsor can usually have ongoing engagement, as they do in Australia with the TGA for regulatory purposes, although the sponsor can meet with the government bureaucrats who support the PBAC prior to the dossiers being submitted, the advice given is not binding. Moreover, that's when it stops. You cannot have any direct engagement with the PBAC or the bureaucrats or the specialist subcommittees. All you get is the opportunity to provide written responses to specific reports that are sent to you during that 16-week process. But they can be managed quite nicely. Elaine, I have seen you have a question. Do manufacturers often submit their products for market authorization and reimbursement in Australia later than in the US and EU? No. In fact, Australia is usually a first-tier country because of its influence. I mentioned earlier that the PBAC started before anybody else in terms of economic evaluations. And so because the data requirements are incredibly high level and the strategy employed to secure funding is often a notch above what is required for other countries, Australia is usually a first-tier country. In all the companies I've worked for over my lengthy time in this job, we were always along the same timelines. And in fact, in a couple of instances, we predated NICE, and we've worked on a recent one for that because the PBAC's decision is global and it's very influential. Moreover, Australia is a reference pricing market for many countries, particularly Brazil, which is a huge pharmaceutical market. So Australia is not down the bottom, even though we're a smaller country population-wise. In terms of the influence in the HTA world, we're at the top, along with NICE. So it's if you get it right in Australia, usually you can adapt what's done for other markets as well. So it's helpful to consider it right up at the beginning. Marty, if I could have the next slide, please, being mindful of time. So health technology assessment. I've talked about a lot of these things, but I'll just run through them very briefly. It's a very sophisticated market in terms of HTA. Australia is considered an HTA leader. You've got to really carefully consider the most appropriate methodology for access in Australia, and I alluded to that when I mentioned go for a subgroup that's got incredible data where you'll optimize your price, because your price will be based on the clinical benefit. That comes first. It will be compared to something, even if it's no current treatment. So the better your benefit, the better your price. Learn from industry experts with local and international experience. Vanessa was talking about the need for getting the people right. And this is where a market access lead if you're going to launch in Australia, is really critical, because they have a huge role to play. It was often said to me when I first entered this world after being in hospitals, without you, we don't have a product. And actually, in the main, that's true, because Nikki mentioned private pay earlier. And there is very little private pay for pharmaceuticals in Australia because the Australian healthcare, or the Australian community, has got used to the PBS. It was started in 1948 after the war. And so it is expected that people can get access to a drug without having to pay a large amount of money for it. Having said that, they're more than prepared to pay a large amount for supplementary medicines and that sort of area. So that is a private pay market, but not medicines. Understanding the payer in Australia and the drivers is critical, because the PBAC and the MSAC do have their differences. And this is where Kieran has a huge benefit of many years working both in government and then in the pharma industry, his insights into how to work collaboratively with the government, and particularly the bureaucrats, because ministers may come and go, different parties come in and out of office, but the bureaucrats remain. They have long memories. In terms of the submissions, requirements and timelines do vary based on device risk and category for MSAC. There are fees involved now, cost recovery fees for submissions. We do have special pricing agreements and risk share agreements, and PBS lifecycle management and timeline for mandatory price reductions, etc., which is all getting very complex. And I think it's probably time to whip to the last slide, or is it the... All right, I think, no, we'll go through this very quickly, focusing on unmet need. If you've got something for unmet need, that's a huge plus at the beginning. You must know the clinical pathway, and that's why it's so important to start early on engagement with your clinical community and your patients who will be using this device or the technology. What's your evidence? Are there gaps? If there are gaps, how do you fill them? Could it be a registry? Could it be real-world data, etc.? Your economic evaluation, I've already talked about that. And then the budget impact is also a huge consideration for the Australian government, because the federal government pays for the pharmaceutical or the device. That's where the funds are spent. And I think then there's one more slide. Sorry, Marty, very mindful of the time. I think that we've covered most of that already. Yes, yes, there is the opportunity to learn from the HTA environment and integrate what you do in Australia into other markets. So it's not something that's just a one-use process. You can adapt and rejig for other markets. Thank you very much for your time. It's a very whistle-stop tour through what is a very complex but ultimately rewarding section of the Australian healthcare market. Marty, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Nikki, for taking us through the regulatory and PBAC, MSAC, and market access processes in Australia, and a lot of information to get through in a short period of time. And we'd love to take further questions as we move along. If there's no immediate questions now, I think what we'd really like to know is, how does this actually feed into what are the market opportunities? And I'm going to hand back to James to take us through that.
Thanks, Marty. Maybe if we can move to the first slide, but just to reiterate what you were saying, and also Kate, that whilst it can be quite complex, the rewards can be significant, not only within the context of Australia, but also how you're able to leverage those listings in overseas jurisdictions. And when I talk about significant opportunities, there are a number of opportunities, and the drivers of those opportunities is what I wanted to talk about very briefly with this slide here in Australia. I mean, we have a population of around 27 million people, which by the standard of other developed countries is relatively small. However, the population of Australia is growing at a significant rate, about 2.5%, which is much faster than other developed countries of around 0.3%. And that's driven predominantly by immigration. So migration makes up a significant part of that growth. And with a growing population, of course, there's going to become that greater need for healthcare and consuming of healthcare collateral and products as well. Within the context of that population, I think Nikki mentioned before that literally 3/4 of that population are not only focused in the major cities, but also focused down the East Coast in 3 or 4 of those cities. So quite a condensed population in terms of where it is that you might need to think about focusing your resources from a commercialization perspective as well. And of course, as I mentioned before, that population is getting older and consuming a lot more healthcare. Some numbers around the investment that Australia makes in healthcare. Australia is not shy in investing in healthcare, and in fact invests higher than the OECD average of around 9.5%. Our healthcare spending in Australia is about 10% of GDP, and that tops out at in excess of 250 billion Australian government. 250 billion Australian dollars, I'm sorry. The majority of that is funded by the government, with 29% of that coming from individuals, private health insurance, and other sources as well. So opportunity in terms of a growing population, an aging population, and a concentrated population, and a society that is willing and able to invest in healthcare. In addition to that, the other opportunities that we've highlighted in the context of Australia have to do with the clinical trials area in particular. And as I mentioned before, clinical trial investment in Australia is anywhere from 1.4 to 1.8 billion Australian dollars in any given year, with around almost 2,000 trials each year underway in Australia. And that's growing at a CAGR, projected to grow at a CAGR out to 2030 of about 7.5%. And it is a significant employer within Australia as well. Around 8,000 Australians are employed directly with the implementation of clinical trials. This is why the government's interested in it. This is why the government provides incentives for companies to enter Australia and to conduct clinical trials here in Australia, not only directly, but also through incentives like the R&D tax incentive, where companies under $20 million are potentially eligible to make claims of 43.5%, and those that have revenues in excess, slightly less at around 38%. The other area of investment the government is encouraging is in manufacturing and high-tech manufacturing, onshore mRNA, as I mentioned before. There's also a very strong commitment to advanced manufacturing, cell and gene therapies, and also viral vectors. Next slide, Marty. So speaking about opportunities, what is it that your business might need to think about in order to get themselves ready to commercialise their products or services here in Australia? Well, in many instances, what it is that you might have done for Europe is actually going to provide a very good framework for what you can do here in Australia. There are, of course, some specific nuances across the commercial readiness model that are worth calling out. But across the areas of, I'm going to call it market research and market analytics, the sort of work that you might have done for Europe by way of customer or audience segmentation and profiling, those sorts of services are readily available through third-party vendors here in Australia, and they understand exactly the same sort of approaches and techniques that you may have used before. Where there are some nuances is potentially with the IQVIA data. In other jurisdictions, individual doctor prescribing data is available. That is not the case in Australia, unfortunately. But you can get pretty close down to a brick level, which consists of 2 to 3 pharmacies. The other nuance here is that direct-to-consumer, I'm getting ahead of myself here. That's on another slide, the next slide. But the other component of commercial readiness to think about is the business model that you want to have. What are the distribution channels that you're going to focus on? Will they be retail pharmacy? Is it primary care? Or is it the hospital environments in particular? Yeah, I'm sorry, I just looked. IP is also another area that is similar in many ways to what you may have experienced in Europe in terms of the availability for use to protect your intellectual property, being patents, trademarks, and design rights. Regulatory compliance is a little bit different, particularly when it comes to import licenses and regulations and things like that. Australia has very strict biosecurity laws, and that transitions itself across pharmaceuticals products as well. And so that's something to be mindful of and that needs to be navigated. And also Australia, particularly for biologic products in the early phases, their availability on the market, will request samples for testing batches as well. And how that's navigated can be important to your product being maintained in the market and maintaining your market authorization. And as Nikki mentioned before, other programs such as patient familiarization programs, named patient programs are also widely available in Australia. One area of nuance that may be different from other markets in Europe, in particular Germany, is that of some of the market trends around retail pharmacy. Retail pharmacists in Australia are having more and more, obtaining more and more prescribing rights and undertaking more consultations in the retail pharmacy than they have done in the past. And they have special consulting areas in the retail pharmacy where they can monitor blood pressure, they can re-prescribe certain products and dispense them immediately without the need to visit a primary care physician. So these are some of the nuances to think about in order to get yourself ready to commercialise in Australia. By and large, many of them are similar, but there are nuances. Marty, maybe we can move to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where I got a bit ahead of myself before, for which I apologise. When it comes to the execution of your commercial strategies, again, there are some nuances. And in the areas of marketing, development of your strategies, your value propositions, your key messages, again, that's probably very similar and might need to be nuanced with the local target audiences in mind. One area that is different is that there is no direct-to-consumer advertising permitted here in Australia. There are only 2 jurisdictions for which you may be aware. One of them is New Zealand, and the other one being the US. So I think this is an evolving area, and we are seeing a need and a demand for more information to be made available to consumers and to patients. And so I think that's an evolving space, which is important to watch. The use of medical education in Australia is again similar to what you see in Europe. We have a function of medical scientific liaisons that is permitted in Australia that are able to balance between on-label and off-label communications around a particular product. They have limited involvements with other commercial functions and operate within their organisations accordingly. CME accreditation through universities and other educational bodies is permitted and does happen, particularly across the wide spectrum of professional development. And self-care, the concept of self-care and health literacy is becoming more and more important here as well. Customer support is always something to consider. And again, I don't think there are any radical differences here between what you see in Europe. Sales functions and how you configure your sales team, whether you're going to have face-to-face selling or whether you have tele-sales, the provision of sales targets and revenue projections are all very similar. Training requirements as well. And also the way in which analytics are managed. Likewise, supply chain operations, the availability of 3PL and 4PL logistics providers is quite widely used. Marty, that was it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, James, and really appreciate the overview of the commercial opportunities for Australia. We might just step ahead now. We're just conscious of time and go to the financial opportunity to establish a presence in Australia. And so I'm going to hand over to Fiona to take us through the next 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you, Fiona.
Oh, Fiona, I think you're on mute still.
Sorry. Well, good evening, everybody. Good morning if you're in Germany. I'm Fiona Henderson, and I'm the principal of Argyll Law. I'm a commercial and disputes lawyer based in Australia, and I work closely with many foreign-owned companies, besonders deutschsprachige, particularly in the health and life sciences space. And these are often companies entering, expanding into and operating in Australia. And my background has been built over more than 30 years of legal practice, and that's in complex commercial disputes. And what that experience has made me very good at is spotting where things go wrong and helping clients structure things so they don't. So what I'm going to walk you through today is some ways to structure things in the Australian market so that you get off to a good start here. So Marty, maybe the next slide. Australia is a remarkable market, as you've heard. It's wealthy, it's stable, it's transparent, and it's innovation friendly. And it rewards companies who get things right from the start. But it can also be incredibly frustrating for those who don't. So often when overseas companies come to me with an exciting product and a solid market entry strategy, they often say, we're ready to go. We just need someone local to register it. Marty, next slide, please. And that's when I say, let's just slow down for a moment, because this next step, it's actually one of the most important decisions that you'll make. And we want to make sure that you get it exactly right. And the starting point of that is, if you want to supply therapeutic goods in Australia, you must appoint a local legal entity to take responsibility for that product under our regulatory system. And that entity in Australia is called the sponsor. Next slide, please. And while that might sound like a formality, it's actually a lot more than that. Your sponsor doesn't just support your registration, they own it. They are the legal interface with the Australian regulator. And when something changes or something goes wrong, they're the ones that the law turns to. So you're not just ticking off a compliance box, you're actually establishing your legal identity or your product's legal identity in this market. And that identity begins and is maintained through your sponsor. And that's why this decision, it's not one to rush or outsource without really understanding that. So how do you choose the right setup? What I want to do now is just give you a short preview about what the sponsor does. It's not super different to what happens in Europe, but how your choice of structure here will shape your success. So the next slide, please. Think of the sponsor as your product's legal guardian in Australia. They're not just filing paperwork. They're legally responsible for your product at every stage, before, during, and after it enters the market. And what that means in practice is your sponsor applies for and manages your ARTG listing. They attend pre-submission meetings with the TGA. They ensure your product complies with all relevant standards. They oversee your labelling and promotional compliance and are responsible for that and for the advertising. They report adverse events. They manage recalls. They maintain your pharmacovigilance system. And most importantly, they are the only legal point of contact with the TGA. So the TGA won't speak with you directly. They speak through your sponsor. And your sponsor controls what is said to the regulator, how quickly your issues are escalated, and how your risks are managed and presented to the TGA. And what they say or don't say can carry serious legal and reputational consequences. And it's not something you just want to leave to chance. Your sponsor is legal voice in a highly regulated market. And that's why the next step, how you structure that role, matters so much. So what are your options for sponsorship? The next slide, please, Marty. This is similar to what Vanessa's already said. There are 3 ways to meet your sponsor requirement, and each one's got a different balance of control, complexity, and commercial fit. Some companies arrive here and they've already picked the path, often because it seems quick and it seems familiar. But when you unpack it, it doesn't always give you the freedom or the security that you might expect. The next slide. The first option is to set up your own Australian subsidiary. This is the option I actually recommend most often because it gives you the greatest level of control. When you set up a wholly owned subsidiary in Australia, you keep everything in your hands. The ARTG listing is in your subsidiary's name. You manage the relationship with the TGA. You control how your product is positioned and protected, and you safeguard your commercial and regulatory position from the start. And I think Vanessa alluded to the cost of doing that and bringing out and employing and engaging staff. But this is actually talking about the sponsorship, and you don't actually need to trade through your sponsors. So if there's other ways to build your presence here from a market trading perspective, it doesn't have to be done through your sponsor, but your sponsor is a good place to hold your TGA, ARTG registrations and listings. It may seem like a big step to set up a subsidiary, but practically it's actually very straightforward. You need an Australian business number, you need a registered office, and you need at least one Australian resident director. That's it. My team and I regularly assist with these setups, as does the German Chamber, and most can be done in a few days. Most foreign-owned companies, unless you're really large, are exempt from audit obligations. So the compliance load is lighter than many expect, particularly if you're just using it to hold your sponsorship. And if you're planning to access the R&D tax incentive, then having an Australian entity is not just helpful, it's essential. This path gives you full flexibility, long-term control, and a secure strategic foundation to grow your presence in Australia with confidence. Next slide, Marty, please. The second option is to appoint a third-party sponsor. This model can work well in specific situations, especially if you're testing the market or you've got very limited low-risk product lines in early stages. And some organisations, again, like the German Chamber, they offer third-party sponsorship services for certain low-risk categories of products. Handled properly, with a very clear scope and a very well-documented agreement, this can be a very clean, low-commitment way to get started in the Australian market. But there are trade-offs. First, the ARTG listing is in your sponsor's name, not yours. Their name appears on your product label, and they are the sole voice in communications with the TGA. So that means you don't control the conversation, you don't control the timing, and you may share your sponsor with your competitors. One of my clients, who's a very highly respected European company, discovered that their competitor's product was registered under the same sponsor. Different quality of product, but both products had the same name on their labels, and it looked like both products came from the same source. There's nothing technically wrong here, but the optics, of course, were difficult. So what I always say is you want to choose your sponsor like you choose a business partner. If this is the path that you're considering, it is essential that you have a separate purpose-built sponsorship agreement drafted for Australian conditions, and that will protect your data, your brand, and your position. Marty, next slide, please. The last option is to use your Australian distributor as your sponsor. And this is the option that often seems most attractive, and it's the one I'm most often called in to fix. You found a great local distributor, they offer to act as your sponsor. It feels efficient, it feels flexible. But this model carries the highest risk from a legal perspective, because in this model, you are giving up the most control. Your listing sits in their name, the regulator speaks with them, and if things get complex and your commercial interests diverge, you may find yourself locked out of critical conversations. One client of mine had 15 medical devices delisted after deciding to switch distributors. That was a retaliatory move that took them a year to recover from. And another found themselves exposed to product liability claims after their distributor sponsor admitted fault to the regulator without consulting them. And what the distributor said became the legal foundation for several claims. And the manufacturer had no visibility and no control over what went out to the TGA until it was too late. So the option of choosing your distributor as sponsor, it can work in very narrow cases, but go in with your eyes open and only with watertight standalone agreements, separate from your distribution contract and drafted under Australian law. So to bring this all together, let me leave you with three key takeaways. Your sponsor isn't just a formality or a regulatory contract. They are your legal presence in Australia for your products. So choose them as carefully as you choose your first employee. Secondly, the safest, most strategic path to control your products is to set up your own subsidiary to hold the sponsorship. It's easier and faster than you might think. And finally, if you decide to appoint someone else, whether it's a standalone sponsor or your distributor, make sure your contracts are clear, specific, and drafted for the Australian legal system. That applies not only to your sponsor agreements, but to your employment, your supply, and your distributor agreements as well. Muddy, next slide, please. Don't assume your European templates will work here. They often don't. And it's far cheaper to get it right from the start than to fix it later. Next slide, please. The decision you make here about who your sponsor is and how that role is structured will shape your entire market position in Australia. You want to control the voice, you want to choose your path, and you want to protect your position. And the good news can be found on the next slide. Australia is regulated, yes, but it's also an exceptional place to do business, and I think we've heard that tonight already. With the right structure from the outset, you can access a stable, wealthy market, generous R&D incentives, and a regulatory system that rewards long-term thinking. So get this piece right, and the opportunities are real. And last slide, please. If you're thinking about entering, or you're already here and wondering whether your structure gives you the control you need, then I invite you to keep the conversation going. Thanks again for your time, and I will hand back to Marty for his comments and closing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Fiona. Very informative. And once again, I'll just pause to see if there are any questions for Fiona. And just again, the disclaimer there that we shared earlier today. But your questions answered, I think, is the most important thing. We do only have a couple of minutes left, and I'll again ask my colleagues to just maybe moderate the chat, but anybody that wants to come off mute and ask any questions now, please do so.
Thank you very much, everyone, for like very insightful presentations. Will you be able to share some of the slides with the participants?
Yes, we'll loop back and share a moderated deck with the participants for sure.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to share that around.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for your time today. Before we close up, I just wanted to share, if everybody has very unique circumstances, and so on behalf of Argyll Law and Access Healthco, if you did want to follow up and understand a little bit more detail about the Australian healthcare landscape, the significant opportunities that they present, we would be very happy to set up a more specific workshop with yourselves, obviously focused on your assets and your products, if you would like to progress that further. Otherwise, please reach out to myself or Fiona directly, and our details we'll share with you after this workshop. as well, and we'd be happy to have one-to-one conversations and understand your specific circumstances. And so in closing, I'd like to once again thank my colleagues, thank Fiona from Argyll Law, and particularly the German Chamber and Bettina for setting this up and making this available to all of you. And I'd really like to thank you, last of all, for your participation tonight, for listening in, and looking forward to any follow-up questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you to all the amazing speakers. If there are no questions here right now, I would also say that we are like very German. We finish exactly on time, 7 p.m. Please feel free to reach out either directly if you know the contact details. Otherwise, I'm always happy to put you in contact with any of the speakers. So feel free to reach out, take up the offer that Marty's just shared. That's a really great opportunity to get a little bit deeper if you're really considering coming into the Australian market. And I'm happy to support the connection to all of our speakers here today. With that, I think we're all going to like the well-deserved evening now here in Australia. And like for those who are joining us from Europe, have a good day ahead of you. And I look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks' time for the second edition of this.